Bhayahari. Mukham karoti vachanam pangam langyate girim yat kripatamaham vande Sri Gurudina Taranam Paramanandam Madhavam. Okay, so we had finished the third chapter last week, which was the eligibility to perform devotional service. And we talked about the three grades of devotees, the Kanishtadhikari, the Madhyamadhikari, and the Uttyamadhikari, and how the gradation is done based on two factors, faith and knowledge. And the Kanishtas have weak faith and weak knowledge. The Madhyamadhikaris, they have strong faith but weak knowledge. And the Uttamadhikari have strong faith and strong knowledge. And we also talked about, so we talked about the qualifications to bhakti, and we also talked about the disqualifications, right? So we talked about the two disqualifications, which is bhukti and mukti. So bhukti is a desire to enjoy the senses and the mind, and mukti is the desire for liberation. And there were several Shastric quotes given by Rupa Goswami and Srila Prabhupada, talking about how the practitioners of bhakti reject both these aspects. So I know we didn't have time for questions, so I'll pause here and see if there is any discussion based on the last week's class. Okay, if not, then we will continue to the fourth chapter of the Nectar of Devotion, which is devotional service surpasses all liberation. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Chapter 4. So the main points from, so 4 and 5 are kind of linked. So the main points are that we were talking about qualifications and disqualifications, right? We were talking about knowledge and faith, and we were talking about mukti and bhukti. The point that is made is that these are refinements, right? Tathastha Lakshana, secondary criterias. The only qualification for bhakti is a desire to please Krishna. And the reason for that is that bhakti is not dependent on anything. We'll see later on that how all different activities, they require a certain amount of, they have a prerequisite. And without that, one cannot practice that anga, right? If one is practicing Astanga Yoga, they need to have complete control of the mind. If one is practicing Gyan, that person needs to have detachment. One is practicing karma, the person needs to have faith in the scriptures. So there's those prerequisites that are there. Bhakti does not have that. So Rupa Goswami wants to make that clear, that even though he's talking about these things that make one gets one to the platform of pure bhakti, but one should not confuse that as considering that bhakti is dependent on them. So chapter 4 we'll see evidence of devotees who are free from desires of bhakti and mukti. So this was a topic that was developed in the 3rd chapter, and the 4th chapter expands on that. So, for example, Vrajvasis, they reject all desires for liberation, even personal liberation and Vaikuntha. That's an example that they're rejecting mukti. So essence of this chapter is rejection of bhakti and mukti. So we see Rupa Goswami quoting extensively from the scriptures. Right? So Prithu Maharaj's prayers to the 4 Kumaras, where he says that that if I have no chance of hearing the glories of the Lord, then I don't desire liberation. Right? I think we did the chapter, right? We completed the 4th chapter.
Yes, Prabhu.
We did.
Yes, Prabhu, we did.
We did last week.
We completed, right? That's what.
Yes.
Yes. So I'll scroll down to the 5th chapter then. Okay. So down to the 5th chapter. So the 5th chapter is talking about the purity of devotional service. Right? So in the previous 2 chapters, there was a description of the eligibility. So knowledge, faith, rejection of mukti and mukti. In this chapter, we will see that conventional prerequisites, and 3 are talked here. One is a pious birth, the second is praishchit, and the third is varnashram dharma. They are not considered to be prerequisites for bhakti. Right? So it is not dependent on any of these 3 prerequisites. It's independent and self-sufficient. So the summary is that pure devotional service is self-sufficient and independent. And this is a very important concept because we have consistently said that bhakti is the fundamental constitutional position of the jiva. So before anything else happens, the jiva gets the right to execute bhakti. So everything can come from bhakti, but bhakti cannot come from anything else. It's like a child can come from the father, but not the other way around. So bhakti is the mother of everything else. And this concept is also important because in the Chaturshloki of Bhagavatam, Brahma, so Chaturshloki Bhagavatam is spoken by Lord Vishnu to Brahma, and Lord Vishnu makes this point that bhakti can be performed by everybody at all times, in all places, and under all circumstances. It's a very powerful statement that's made. And if bhakti is so universally predominant, then the understanding is that it cannot be dependent on anything. Because at some place, maybe Gyan may not be there. At some place, Vairagya may not be there. At some place, the following of Varnashram Dharma is not there. So if that statement is made that bhakti is fully, is all prevalent, then the corollary to that is that it is fully independent. So in the and as usual, after Rupa Goswami makes a statement, he will give many Shastric references, right? So what is the requisite purity for performing devotional service? And the point that is made is that it is not dependent on karma kand, it is not dependent on gyan, and it is not dependent on asthana, right? So it is not dependent on any manifestation of any process. Bhakti is so pure that it can purify anything and everything, and bhakti is independent, so it is not dependent on anything, but other things may be dependent on bhakti. Okay. So these are the points that are expanded, that is not dependent on pious birth. So what does this mean? A pious birth is a birth in a Brahman family, in a wealthy family, in a cultured family. So sometimes the Brahmanas may make this point that because they're born in Brahman families, only they can execute bhakti. Or sometimes they'll make the opposite point, that if somebody is born in a low-class family, in a Nishad or a Chandal, they cannot execute bhakti. But here Rupa Goswami is negating that point. And Srila Prabhupada gives the example of independence from birth. So after Lord Nityananda Prabhu left the planet, his descendants were known as Nityananda Vamsha. And as things happen because of the influence of the age of Kali, after a few generations, the message of Mahaprabhu and Nityananda Prabhu became distorted. So then the Nityananda Vamsis, they started saying that the devotional service only belongs to them because they are in the lineage of Nityananda Prabhu. You will see some traces of this even current day. And if you go to Vrindavan, most of the temples over there are managed by the descendants of the Goswamis. And they will make similar statements that we are in the lineage of this particular Goswami, and we have the foremost right to worship the deities or etc. Actually, a lot of it is just commerce, because these temples, some of them are very opulent, with one way to keep it in the family. So this is an artificial way. And actually, Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he very courageously fought against them. And it was not just a philosophical debate. His life was actually in danger because there was such strong vested interests. But Bhakti Siddhanta is known as the Simha Guru. Srila Prabhupada is also known as Simha Guru because fearless, Simha means lion. So when he successfully established with so much of references to the scriptures that there is complete independence of bhakti from birth. So then Bhakti Siddhanta made the statement that the highest qualification in the material world, namely to be in the mode of goodness, has already been achieved by such a person. I'm sorry, this is Srila Prabhupada's word. So he's making this point that by the practice of bhakti, everything else is obtained. Because bhakti is in pure goodness, the mode of goodness is already there. Right? So rather than bhakti depending on birth, other things depend on bhakti. So this is a statement from Padma Puran, that the only qualification Every high-born or low-born person can take a cold early morning a bath in the winter month. And the only qualification is that he wants to do it. Similarly, the only qualifications to practice bhakti is a desire to please Krishna. And this is from the Skanda Puran, that people of impious birth who begin to follow Vaishnava Dharma become even more purified than the highest born Brahmanas. So there's a quote in the Bhagavatam that says that even if a dog eater begins to chant the holy name, he's considered to be the most pious. And this analogy is given to explain why. Because one may argue that a low birth is a sign of impiety. That past sinful activities, sinful predisposition, that gives a person a low birth, a family of meat eaters or people who are outside the Vedic, following the Vedic principles. So from a perspective of demonstrating, one can say that a low birth means impiety. So even if one does not consider low birth in itself, one should consider impiety as a disqualification to bhakti. Now the analogy that is given is that so the alchemists have this particular kind of metal that when it is touched to the bell metal, then the bell metal becomes gold. So the bell metal itself does not have the qualification, but simply by the touch of this metal, it becomes gold. So simply by the touch of bhakti, all the impiety in the person gets eradicated. And when we were talking about the 6 symptoms of bhakti, we talked about Kleshangini and Subhada. This is an example of that. That one of the kleshas is having a fallen birth, but all these kleshas are burnt away. Okay, so Prabhupada also makes the statement of being of taking bhakti too cheaply. That when somebody hears these kind of things about the potency of bhakti, so they say, okay, I'll take initiation, and now I am beyond all modes of material nature, I'm pure, etc. So Prabhupada says that you should not think that simply by the acceptance of such initiation, his business is then finished. One still has to follow the rules and regulations very carefully. If after accepting the spiritual master and being initiated but does not follow the rules and regulations of devotional service, then he is again fallen. Once somebody asked Srila Prabhupada that you have initiated so many disciples and very few of them are still with you and the rest have left. So would you like to comment about it? And then Prabhupada made the statement that they were never my disciples. They said, but Prabhupada initiated them. Prabhupada still said, they're never my disciples. So one does not become a disciple simply by initiation. One becomes a disciple by following the instructions of the spiritual master. So previously we established that birth is not a requirement for bhakti. Atonement is also not a requirement for bhakti. So especially in India, atonement is fairly prevalent, mostly in the form of fasting and charity. There are different kinds of prayashchits for different kinds of things, right? So and these are recommended in the scriptures. I mean, now most of them are done whimsically, but Prayashchit is a bona fide process that is given in the scriptures to mitigate the effects of past reaction. It's kind of like you committed a sin, and for that you have to go to get a punishment, but you voluntarily are taking the punishment. So because you're voluntarily taking it, the punishment is less, and then you take it on your own terms. So Prayashchit is one of the very powerful tools given in the scriptures for purification. So charity is basically giving your wealth and getting the blessings of others. Fasting, as I mentioned, praying, and here it's more praying to the demigods. And again, the same statement is made that bhakti is not dependent on Prayashchit. Therefore, one need not be pure before taking up devotional service. One becomes purified by taking up devotional service. Right? It's a powerful statement made over here. So, if bhakti is the process that purifies a person, what if a person who is executing bhakti becomes impure? And the process is that the person should simply continue to follow the process while experiencing sincere regret for the fall down. There is no need for any other means of purification. Again, Chaitanya Leela, there is this pastime of the person, I forget his name, but he got into a quarrel with one of those Muslim leaders, and the person made him drink water from a pot that he had drunk water himself from. And this person was a Brahmin, so he was completely devastated that I've drunk water from a pot that was used by a Muslim to drink. And then he goes asking different Brahmins that what's the prayashchit I need to do. And somebody said you need to drink hot ghee and kill yourself. Somebody said you need to jump into a river and kill yourself. Different prayashchits were being given. And finally, the person went to Mahaprabhu, and Mahaprabhu said that the only prayashchit that you need to do is to chant the holy name. That is fully capable of. And these are the references in the Bhagavatam that the only qualification for devotional service is to engage in devotional service as outlined by the acharyas. Right? One of the requirements of devotional service, at least in the initial status, is that it is not whimsically done. It is done according to the rules and regulations that are given. Third point is Varnashram. Varnashram dharma is synonymous to Karma Kand. Karma Kand essentially is following the karmic do's and don'ts. So Varnashram dharma talks about one is Varna, that you have to be as a Brahman or a Kshatriya, and talks about ashram. So even now, sometimes people will say, if somebody takes to Krishna consciousness at a young age, they will say, well, you're still young, you're just married. This is not the right time for you to execute all this religious stuff. You enjoy life. And then when you're retired, then you take to all this. Right now, time for you to enjoy. So it's a distorted representation, but essentially it is Varnashram. That in different Varnas, there are facilities to enjoy. And finally, when you're at Vanaprastha and Sannyas, then you start executing the spiritual practices more seriously. So pure devotional service immediately takes one to the platform of surrendering to the Lord. Right? So there's no need for the gradual elevation. One does not have to wait to be born as a Brahman. One does not have to wait to become a sannyasi. Right from birth, the person is fully qualified to execute bhakti. And this is a quote from the Bhagavatam, that devotional service independently accomplishes the purification achieved through Varnashram Dharma. Therefore, even if one does not execute his specific occupational duty, but immediately takes direct shelter of the lotus feet of Hari, there will be no fault on his part. And then there is a long list of scriptural quotes that are given. This gets us to the end of the 5th chapter. And before going further, I want to pause here and see if there is any discussion on what we have said so far, or maybe in the previous lecture, and then I'd like to do a review. Yes, Rajiv Shamprabhu.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, Dandavat Pranam. So in this slides, I think when we were going through, is bhakti same or synonyms to pure devotional service? Are we saying that bhakti and pure devotional service are the same, or devotional service, like, because I'm trying to think, like, devotional service and pure devotional service, are they same thing or are they different? Is there like impure devotional service, or maybe mixed devotional service?
So based on your understanding of the definition of bhakti, how would you answer the question? It's a good question. It's a question that I would have asked you probably. So you're asking me, I'm trying to bounce it back. Based on your understanding of the Paribhasha Sutra, how would you answer that question?
Pure devotional service is where you are not expecting anything for yourself and you are doing it for the pleasure of Krishna.
No, so slight difference here.
Okay.
So we talked about 2 categories of requirements for bhakti.
Mm-hmm.
One is what is known as the primary, the Swarup Lakshan, which is you do it for Krishna. If you don't do it for Krishna, you can't call it bhakti. Right? It can be called something else, but not bhakti. But now, if you're doing it with Krishna without any motivations, then it becomes Shuddha Bhakti. So the difference between Bhakti and Shuddha Bhakti is that Shuddha Bhakti is without any motivation. Anavilashita Shunyam Gyan Karmadi Anagatam. That is Shuddha Bhakti. But even if Bhakti is being done with full desires, with sakam, and with a desire for knowledge, with a desire for material gains, it's still bhakti. But it is known as Mishra Bhakti. What we are talking in this chapter is bhakti. We are not talking about Shuddha Bhakti. So the potency of bhakti, even if it is executed with motivations, it is fully independent. It automatically transcends any need to do Praishchit or Varnashram or Janma. So even in a mixed form, bhakti has that potency. Yeah.
Thank you.
Rajkumar Prabhu.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. So in the last slide, it says that even if one does not execute his specific occupational duty, what are those occupational duties? Like we are told that we have to do our prescribed duties, right? Like also, if you are a Vaishya, you have to do Go Seva, and you are a Brahman, you have to do deity worship, etc. Does it refer to this, or what does this occupational duty mean here?
So it's said that for every varna and ashram, there are certain duties that are allocated. Like, for instance, for a grahastha, the duty is that he takes care of the family, gives in charity, and contributes to the society. Different duties, category of duties are prescribed. What the statement here is saying is that let's assume the grahastha gives up everything. He gives up his family, he gives up his wife, he stops contributing to the society for the sake of executing devotional service. There is no fault in it. Because by the execution of devotional service, all these duties are automatically executed. Like we take the example of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Now, in an original position, he's the personality of Godhead, but he took sannyas at the age of 24. He had a young wife who was fully dependent on him. He had an old mother who was a widow who was fully dependent on him. And he was just 24. Right? So by all considerations, sannyas was not recommended for him. But he took it. And it is glorified, part of it because he's the Lord, but part of it also that why did he take sannyas? For the sake of practicing pure devotional service. In his case, it was pure devotional service, for preaching, for spreading the holy name. So sannyas is glorified. When Srila Prabhupada was accepting disciples, so he was accepting disciples, men and women, boys and girls, young, and sometimes the parents would get upset at him, saying that now is the time for them to study, now is the time for them to get a job, and you are misdirecting them. And Prabhupada would say that there's no misdirection. On the strength of the scripture, we can understand that by the execution of bhakti, all these duties are already executed.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Okay. Thank you. Vajranath Prabhu?
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. So in one of the slides for the Prayachita, right? So there's one word called prepare. What does prepare mean for Prayachita?
So I can guess. So these slides are by Urmila Mataji.
Okay.
So I can guess that preparation is it would be guess. I don't know. I don't know what it means.
Okay. Thank you.
Bhayahari Prabhu?
I have a few questions, Prabhu. First question is about bhakti being independent. So, is it possible that a person can become a bhakta without going through the process of self-realization, maybe in their previous births or even in this birth to a certain degree? So what I'm trying to say is basically, can bhakti sprout without any kind of dependence on previous sanskaras, basically? That is one question. And the second question is about you mentioned a lot of I'm gonna say, it is not just you, I'm gonna say in our sastras also, basically there is a mention about the classes of birth, right? High class birth and low class birth and so on and so forth. It's a little bit controversial topic in this day and age. How do we really contextualize that particular concept, right, in this modern days, so that it is easy for people to understand that we are not trying to differentiate between that kind of connotation, basically.
Sure. Thank you, Prabhu. So the answer to the first question that you asked is there any prior qualification one has for bhakti? If one has been executing bhakti in the previous lives, that's the qualification. That there are devotees who take to the process very quickly. They make very rapid advancements. You see young devotees taken to the process. Prabhupada would give the example of dry wood and wet wood. Sometimes you try to burn wood and it does not really burn because it's wet. And sometimes it's dry, it burns quickly. So people who have been practicing bhakti in the previous life, they're like dry wood. And as soon as they come in contact with devotees or a scripture, they quickly take to the process. So that's the only qualification that is needed, that there is a prior attraction or prior execution of bhakti. Other than that, performance of austerities or giving in charity or study of the scriptures, these are not considered to be prerequisites. They can, so Vishwanath Chakravarti makes this point that they can create an environment that is conducive to getting the mercy of a devotee. It's like you're going out on book distribution and there are two people in front of you. There's one person who's sitting with a bottle of alcohol and he hasn't taken a bath in several days, and there's another person who's nice and clean and neat, and you'll probably go and try and give the book to the second person. Now, it's not that the first person is not qualified to perform bhakti, he is qualified. But the mercy of the devotee may be directed one way or the other. So there is some impact on it in terms of how the mercy flows. But Rupa Goswami here, he is talking about it like a science. So what Vishwanath Chakravarti talks about it from a more experiential state, from a practical perspective, what happens, Rupa Goswami is establishing the theory, the tattvas. And the point that he makes is that there is absolutely no pre-qualification for one taking bhakti, because that would contradict some of the basic definitions of bhakti. That is the constitutional right of every soul. It can be practiced anywhere, anytime, by everyone. So all those basic definitions of bhakti, they cut you to the point where you have to accept this premise that bhakti is completely independent.
Yes, Prabhu, I got it. About the second question?
So, Prabhu, regarding the second question, in the current day and age, everybody is a Shudra. So this question is a little bit academic, right? In the Bhagavatam, it is said that, Kalau Shudra Sambhavate. In this day of Kali, even the so-called Brahmins, they may be Jati Brahmins, they may be born in Brahmanical families, but are they following the Brahmanical Varna really? And like it said, a Brahman, what are the qualities of the Brahman? They never accept employment from anybody. They will never work for anybody. That's the quality of a Shudra. Patan Patan, Yajan Yajan, Dan Pratikriya. Their life is in the study of the scriptures, teaching of scriptures, performing yagyas for themselves and others, receiving charity, giving in charity. That's the quality of a Brahman. But now people say, okay, my name is XYZ Chaturvedi. So that's why I'm a Brahman. It's a different matter. The person not even studied one Veda, but his name is Chaturvedi, so he says, I'm a Brahman. Depending on who you're talking to, I mean, you can't tell everybody that you're a Shudra. One way to present it is that, even the remnants of the Varnashram Dharma are very weak in this current day and age. So really speaking, there is no need for anybody to take offense because everybody is pretty much in the same class.
Thank you, Prabhu. Very nicely explained. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prabhu. Okay, so let me, I don't see any more hands, so let me move on to the review. I'll share my screen again. Okay, so essentially with this chapter, we have ended more or less the philosophical part of NOT. After that, it is just enumerations. And I want to make sure that the philosophy of Bhakti is very clear in all our minds. So in practice, there will be many variations. Rupa Goswami makes this point that, and we have seen it. So, but as long as the philosophy is clear, we will not be bewildered by the variations. Like sometimes in temple, the priests will have this debate amongst them. Should I offer ghee lamp 7 times around the body, 4 times, 3 times, whatever it is? And sometimes these debates get very heated, which is okay, which is the way of how they serve the Lord. But as long as the philosophical basis is clear, then they take their own place. They should never cover one's bhakti. So, like I said, this more or less finishes the philosophical aspect of bhakti. I want to go through it with you. And after that, more or less, my lecturing on the NOD comes to an end. And I'm going to, from the next class onwards, it's going to be presentation by the groups. So let's go over the review of the philosophy of bhakti. So we talked about the definition of bhakti. I talked about it a few minutes ago, that it has 3 essential qualities. It should be directed towards Krishna, it should be favorable towards Krishna, and it should be an active engagement. These are the 3 Swarup Lakshan. Any of these 3 are missing, it's not bhakti. Right? If it is not directed towards Krishna, it's not bhakti. If it is directed towards Krishna but not in a favorable way, it's not bhakti. If there is no active engagement, it's not bhakti. Right? So these are the 3 essential. And we talked about the 2 preferred things, that it should be anabhilashita shunyam jnana karmadhyana, that it should be free from any motivations and not covered by jnana karmadhi, like by speculative knowledge, by fruitive activities, astanga yoga, etc. If the secondary characteristics are present, then it becomes Shuddha Bhakti. If they are absent, it becomes Mishra Bhakti. Right? So this is how we understand the definition of Bhakti. Then we talked about the 6 characteristics of Shuddha Bhakti that manifest at different stages. So Kleshangini and Shubhada, that burning away of sinful desire, of suffering. Subhada is all auspiciousness that appears during the sadhana stage of bhakti. Then moksha labhuta akrat and sudurlabha, that one will actually begin to look down upon moksha labhuta akrat, the liberation, and sudurlabha very difficult to attain. These appear at the second stage of bhav. And the 5th state is Sandaratma Visheshatma, which means that one experiences incalculable bliss and Krishna Akarshani. It attracts Krishna. So these appear at the stage of prema. So 3 stages of bhaktis, that sadhana bhakti, bhava bhakti, and prema bhakti, and these 6 characteristics appear at different stages. Then we also talked about how bhakti is the only way to uproot sin. And for that, Rupa Goswami talks about the cycle of sin, that from avidya comes bija, the seed of sin, and then from that one develops sinful propensities, like, and then from that one does sinful activities, and from sinful activities comes a prarabdha, then prarabdha comes unmanifested and manifested reaction. So in this way, this cycle of bija, kuta, pap, aprarabdha, and prarabdha, this continues to feed upon itself, and it is also being fed by avidya, which is why there is no way to break this cycle of suffering except by bhakti, because bhakti, it takes away avidya. The avidya that is causing the cycle to run is ignorance about one's own constitutional position. That because of that, everything else happens. So what bhakti does is that it puts one in the right constitutional position. So avidya becomes vidya. Bhakti not only does that, it also affects and removes the reactions at each and every stage. Kuta, bija, papa, prarabdha, every stage, even at prarabdha. It's that even manifest sinful reaction. One who's already suffering the results of one's past karmic activities, even that is taken away by bhakti. So this is the potency of bhakti. Okay, so we talked about the three stages of sadhana bhav and prem, and within sadhana bhakti there are two stages, Vaidhi bhakti and Raghunath bhakti. Vaidhi bhakti is done externally. The impetus for Vaidhi bhakti is following the instructions of the Guru and the Shastra. Raghunath bhakti is also done externally, following rules and regulations, but there is more pleasure out of it, rag. There is more attachment. So one may follow the rules and regulations because one feels they need to be followed, that is sadhana Vaidhi bhakti, or one may follow the rules and regulations because they enjoy following the rules and regulations. So that is Raghunath bhakti. So chapters 2 to 14 talk about Vaidhi bhakti, and 15-16 talk about Raghunath bhakti. 17-18 will talk about bhava, and the last chapter is prema. So what else did we do? We looked at the eligibility for practicing devotional service. So what is the eligibility? There is only one eligibility, is that one should have a desire to please Krishna. Right? And in terms of advancement, we talked about the three grades of the sadhakas, the Kanishtadhikaris, the Madhyamadhikaris, and Uttamadhikaris based on knowledge and faith. We just spoke about that. We also talked about a more formal definition of sadhana bhakti. Okay. So if everybody could mute their phone, would appreciate that. Thank you. So we were talking about the definition of sadhana bhakti, that it is followed practicing the rules and regulations given by the Guru and the Shastra. We talked about the essence of sadhana bhakti. So the essence of sadhana bhakti is that all these rules and regulations, they rest upon two rules. One should always remember Krishna, and one should never forget Krishna. Right? So important to understand this conceptually, because sadhana bhakti is full of rules and regulations. And sometimes people become niyamagras. Niyamagras means they become too absorbed in the rules and regulations. That this is how you have to do achman, this is how you have to do the mudras, this is how you do the nyas, this is how this time of the day you have to do this. So they become too obsessed with the rules and regulations, but it makes their heart go hard. So the criteria is that all these rules and regulations should nourish these two underlying principles. That it should help one remember Krishna and not forget Krishna. And we also discussed that remembering Krishna is doing the do's, and not forgetting Krishna is not doing the don'ts. Right? So bhakti comes with injunctions and prohibitions. That you chant 16 rounds, you don't eat meat. So by chanting 16 rounds, we remember Krishna. By not eating meat, we do not forget Krishna. Right? So we have to keep this in mind, that it is always nourishing these underlying principles. And then we talked about how bhukti and mukti cover Shuddha Bhakti. Right. So here, if a person is performing bhakti with a desire for bhukti, it is still bhakti. It was the question that was asked, but it's not Shuddha Bhakti, it's Mishra Bhakti. Or a person may be performing bhakti with a desire for liberation, still bhakti, but Mishra Bhakti. But if one is performing or aspiring to perform Shuddha Bhakti, then should be free from bhukti and mukti. And then we talked about how Janma, Praishchit, and Varnashram, they don't make one eligible to perform bhakti, they don't make one ineligible to perform bhakti, because bhakti is supremely independent. So that's the point that we just talked about. So this is the end of the review, and let me see how I'm doing with time. Okay, so there's maybe 8 minutes left. So if there are any questions or comments in this section of the NOD, it's a good time to ask. I see Ajit. Yeah, please go ahead, Ajit Krishna Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji, no problem. So, Prabhuji, my question relates to the cycle of suffering that we just discussed, and how bhakti takes away avidya, which then cuts the cycle. Now, in our practice of sadhana bhakti, at least, we basically follow the four regulative principles, and the hope and the faith that by itself is probably sufficient to at least start to cleanse us. But so one thing I wanted to, well, it's a two-part question. First part, that is that understanding correct, that following the four regulative principles itself is sufficient to help start the cleansing process? And two, what about other impurities outside of the four regulative principles, like, for example, envy, etc.? Will those feed the propensity to commit sinful acts, which further kind of leads to eventually to suffering? So, I mean, I guess my question, or the second part, is more about what are the other things aside or in addition to the four principles that we should be very careful of in order to take advantage of the process of bhakti and not stay stuck.
Thank you, Prabhu. Excellent question. So when we take to the process of bhakti, it's not the four regulative principles, but the chanting of the holy name that is actually giving us the purification. So the four regulative principles are simply creating an environment that is conducive for a sadhaka to perform bhakti. But if you flip it around and say that all I do is to follow four regulative principles, which many people also do, they may not be devotees. They may make pious advancement, but not advancement in devotion. Second part of your question is that what happens if one is performing bhakti and also executing sinful activities, right? So from a theoretical perspective, nothing. Because bhakti is, they're like water and oil. You can perform bhakti while you're performing sinful activities. The Bhagavatam has the example of Vritasur. That if you read in the Bhagavatam, he's fighting with Indra, he's eating people over there, he's killing, and then he's talking. When he starts speaking, he's speaking like a Mahabhagavat. I mean, he's Maharaj Chitraketu, so he's speaking like a Mahabhagavat. He goes back to Godhead, right? So Now, that's an example that is used to illustrate a point. For practicing devotees like us, the reason that we stay clear of overtly sinful activities is because it contaminates our consciousness. So because we are still not fully immersed in bhakti, it contaminates our consciousness. Prabhupada would say that following the 4 regulative principles makes you not an animal, right? So he would say that you follow that and you're not an animal, you're a human being. Now, there are many other aspects of piety that you talked about, which is lack of envy, being helpful to others. So many, the Vedas are filled with it. The focus is not so much in following it separately, but in waiting for them to manifest through the process of bhakti. Right? So one understands that one needs to avoid them. One also understands them that they are difficult to cultivate. Just take one example, equanimity.
Right.
Develop equanimity is very difficult to do. So if one starts pursuing these on their own, then it's a long process and also very difficult to do. So the devotee takes shelter of the devotional process, and through that they develop these qualities. And we have seen this in the lives of devotees around us, that when they go through difficulty, then they display equanimity that is much, much beyond their practice of any piety. Like whether they're faced in adverse circumstances, even death. I was reading about the passing away of Kadam Swami. So they display so much of equanimity, not because they have done any process to cultivate it, but because bhakti automatically manifests all these qualities.
And then, thank you so much for that clarification. That was a very, very detailed and excellent clarification. Thank you so much. It just sparked another more question in my mind. So when these secondary qualities, if you will, like lack of envy and equanimity, etc., even if they are not manifested fully, but because we are chanting the holy name, these qualities will slowly manifest. But in order to go back to the spiritual world, would these qualities also have to be manifested 100%, or as long as we are following the process, and somehow, if by the Lord's mercy we can remember the Lord at the last moment, or I don't know, if at least for so many years, if one is trying to follow the practices of bhakti, will that be sufficient to take us back to Godhead?
So if we have faith in Prabhupada will take us back to Godhead. There was this conversation that Prabhupada was once giving a lecture in a temple, and then he's like speaking very strongly that in order to go back to Godhead, you have to be 100% Krishna conscious. And his disciples, they became very quiet because they said it's very difficult. He says you have to be 90% Krishna conscious. So they're still very quiet. And then he is saying at least 70% Krishna conscious, right? And the point is that the potency of Prabhupada will carry. So I'm not sure if the percentages meant anything. Prabhupada says it probably means, I don't know if they meant anything. But the point that he was making is that the bhakti process is a little bit of ascension, but a lot of descension, that somebody comes in. Like there's this famous picture of a person in that ocean and he has his hands up, and then Krishna is coming on Garud, Lord Vishnu, and he's bending down and picking him up. So we still have to put our hands up, but most of the process is mercy process. Because you're right, otherwise it looks very difficult to have so many qualities that would hold us back in the material world. Not have attraction towards anybody, not have envy, not have any material desires, right? Sometimes it feels that it's not going to be happening that anytime soon. But that's not the process. Our process is we continue to take shelter, and whenever the shelter manifests, then we go. Maybe this lifetime, maybe next lifetime. But our process is to actively take shelter, not passively, but actively. So actively taking shelter means understanding the instructions and following them. That's taking shelter.
Thank you so much, Prabhu.
Thank you. Okay.
Appreciate it.
So little over time, Bhaktivinoda Prabhu, maybe we'll take your question next time. I want you to share the assignments for the next classes. Okay, so as I mentioned that the chapters that are going to come, they're basically enumerations now. So in these set of chapters, Rupa Goswami is going to talk about the 64 elements of Bhakti. And so I understand we have 4 groups, right? Chaitanya Prabhu?
Yes, Prabhu, but probably we might have to rearrange the groups because some of the groups participation is very low. At least that's what I noticed in group 12.
Okay, so I'll leave you to do that. So if we can divide it amongst the groups, that so we have 15 minutes each. So we'll have 3 presentations, 15 minutes for discussion there. So this will basically, from chapter 6 to 13, will take us to the end of Sadhana Vaidhi Bhakti. Chapter 6 to 12 will talk about the 64 rangas, and the 13th chapter will talk about the 5 most potent elements of Bhakti. So just in terms of the presentation format, it would be nice if the groups can do PowerPoint, because this is a little bit more detail oriented. It'll be good to get a visual. I'm not mandating it, but it'd be good if you can put 1 or 2 slides, and that way the other devotees can have something to see. Okay, so we'll end here. Any questions about the presentations?
So Prabhu, the groups, I see group 1, 2, 3, and then group 4, 1, 2, and group 3 and group 4. Is that right? Or
so I've done it based on that we can do 3 chapters.
Okay.
In a presentation. So that's why I did 1, 2, 3, and then the 4th group gets to speak the next week.
Oh, okay. Okay, Prabhu.
Okay.
Okay, Prabhu.
I was thinking of doing 4, but then it becomes very crowded. There'll be no time for any discussion.
Sure.
So next week only 1 chapter, right, Prabhu?
So next week it will be group 1, 2, 3 doing chapter 6, 7, 8.
Okay.
Right, Prabhu?
Yes. So next week we'll do 6, 7, and 8, and we'll start with group 1, group 2, group 3, and then any discussion after that.
Sure.
Is there a number of speakers for each group that we need to plan for? Like, are you expecting multiple speakers for within each group to present?
So I'll leave that up to you. It's a 15-minute session. So I'll leave it up to you. You can have 1 speaker or more than 1 speaker, whatever the group decides.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Is it 15 minutes for each group, Prabhuji?
It's 15 minutes for each group. So these 3 will take 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for discussion.
Okay. And the groups need to be, I think, reorganized, right?
Groups need to be reorganized. I think Chaitanya Prabhu is going to be doing that, balancing the groups.
I will do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhu. I'll put it in the group chat, WhatsApp group chat.
Okay.
Okay, Prabhuji.
I see something in the chat. I don't know. Okay, so Amrita Lila Mataji so this is for Chaitanya Prabhu, that she has joined from last week. So if you can include her in the group also.
Is she not on the WhatsApp group?
She's in the
Yes,
WhatsApp
Prabhu.
group. And
She is, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Haribol.
Okay, so we'll end here. Thank you. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyeva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Anand Koti Vaishnavin ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Thank you very much.
Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Krishna, thank you, Prabhuji.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.